So when I first heard of freelancing, I always thought it was a very mystical area. There wasn't really a lot of people talking about it. An area of life that people tend to either really like or really dislike. The idea of potentially more freedom, more flexibility, higher earning potential got me into freelancing, and the fact that you weren't quite tied into any specific project, person, or team or company. But I started back in July of 2021 through meeting another freelancer who was, funnily enough, replacing me at my full-time role at the time. This particular person did kind of inspire me and educate me in how he got into freelancing and kind of just general tips he could provide me, He talked about what's his average earnings, his process, his mindset. I jumped into freelancing without any backup plans. I remember I just left my full-time role. Yeah, I didn't really plan things out too much. If you have children, a family, a mortgage, or some kind of payment commitment, I wouldn't recommend just jumping. You want to slowly transition into it. So as mentioned, I met this fellow freelancer. My last full-time role was actually handing over my paid search accounts or my pay-per-click accounts that I was managing at the time to him. Hence, I was able to get that initial information about freelancing. After having that discussion with him, it really kind of widened my perspective, not just in terms of earning money, but at the same time, ways of working, being able to challenge paradigms, not necessarily always, following what's portrayed in our day-to-day lives. Like I said, freelancing is such a mystical and not recommended pathway of career, but it's done wonders for me, which I'll explain in the next couple of seconds. The main point that I got from speaking to another freelancer as someone who wasn't a freelancer was just the possibility and how easy it was to actually become one. So in this video, I'll talk more about how I got into freelancing and maybe provide a couple of tips if you're thinking of becoming one. If you're in full-time employment right now and you think getting that job or getting a new job is competitive, bad news is that freelancing is a lot more competitive. And the reason why is that you'll be competing with the best of the best in their field. Contract opportunities don't come around as often as full-time roles. There's less of a demand for it. The supply and demand process of the world of contracting and freelancing is really tied to the economy at a more obvious level. So I'm shooting this video in July of 2023. The market's a bit shaky, but it is improving. Comparing this to what it was 2 years ago, my phone was off the hook. I was getting recruiters, agencies, and clients approaching me, whereas now it's the other way around. I'm having to prospect for clients essentially. So kind of keep that in mind moving forward if you're going to get into freelancing. As mentioned, it's very competitive because you'll be competing with the best of the best, but also you'll be competing with people at a global scale. There tends to be more leniency in how businesses hire for freelancers. They don't really care too much about where you're from my experience. So kind of keep that in mind again. So going back to the story, when I left my full-time role, jumped into freelancing, I'll be very transparent. I think I only had one freelance gig around the end of July. It was an hourly rate gig that I got from Fiverr. I won't talk too much about Fiverr and Upwork in this video, but a quick note on those platforms is it's very competitive. You might send out 20 to 30 different proposals. Maybe you'll hear back from one. You interview, you never really hear back. You'll be competing in terms of price with people willing to work for a cheaper price. It's a really race to the bottom with those platforms. I would highly recommend either applying for freelance opportunities on your standard job websites or actually approach recruitment agencies or go directly to potential clients instead. I didn't actually have a freelance role apart from the hourly gig for about 4 or 5 months. So it was really dry. I was just about to go back into full-time employment around November that same year. And then all of a sudden I had 2 gigs kind of land on my lap pretty out of the blue. And it was interesting that they both offered me a role at the same time. Here's a bit of a secret tip when you're into freelancing. Freelancers are needed with quick turnarounds. You might have a dry season for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and all of a sudden you're presented with 2 or 3, maybe even more opportunities at the same time. And I would recommend saying yes to all those opportunities and stacking it if you can manage it. If you have that capability, if you've systemized within the field you're in and you're quite fast at what you do. Going back to the story, landed 2 opportunities and I was really shocked at the amount of earnings I was making at the time. Those couple of months where I didn't have any gig almost paid for itself within 2 months of me having these new gigs all of a sudden. So yeah, something to kind of keep in mind. When I say it's high earnings potential, potential it actually is. So that's my story of getting into freelancing, but let's talk briefly about pros and cons of freelancing, and I'll be very transparent with both. So pros of freelancing is that you can stack multiple gigs at the same time, especially if you're doing it through your company. There's no rules into saying that you can only work 1 gig at a time. If you want, you can stack up to 7 gigs at the same time. Another pro is that you get higher earnings potential. I would say on average, maybe it's 30 to 40% much more than you'd get for a full-time employment equivalent. Something to keep in mind there. Another pro is that you upskill a lot faster because you're being exposed to different projects, different clients at a faster pace. So in a way, you're really forced to upskill. You don't have the option to really slow down once you have the gig in front of you. You have to just adapt quite quickly. There isn't a lot of onboarding, so you have to figure it out yourself. Whereas in full-time employment, you could kind of ease your way into it. Generally speaking, full-time employment companies do give you that initial training, whereas in freelancing, that isn't going to happen. Another pro of freelancing is that it's highly flexible. As mentioned, it could be a very seasonal type career path. You could decide to be really busy for about 6 months, and then if you want to take a break for another 6 months, you can do that. I've seen people do the same exact thing. Maybe they work a month, they go on holiday, they come back, they freelance again, and then go on holidays. You can find your own rhythm. There's high flexibility to freelancing. Another pro is that it's remote capable. Obviously, this is dependent on your role, but generally speaking, most freelance gigs are digital based. So a lot of companies are a bit more lenient in making sure that the hire for that freelance gig can work remotely. Another pro of freelancing, which is the opportunity to work with small and big projects and clients. And in my case, I was able to work with a couple of big brands within the same year without name dropping. I've worked on accounts such as BMW, Audible, Facebook Gaming, all within the same year. I think with freelancing, you've got that opportunity. Whereas in full-time employment, you'll be working with the same brand for however long. With freelancing, you can work with multiple big brands even at the same time. And then a final pro of freelancing is that, you're exposed to loads of different systems, tools, different types of people and teams as well. And kind of that relates back to the idea of rapidly upskilling, rapidly going to upskill your perspective and your network. So those are the pros of freelancing. So now let's move on to the cons of freelancing. So the first con of freelancing is that income, even there's high earnings potential, it's very seasonal, i.e. it's not very stable. So if you have a family, you have a mortgage, or you have rent to pay, it's something to keep in mind. Preferably you have savings in case of a rainy season. Freelancing is very seasonal. There's going to be months where there isn't any opportunities out there, so something to keep in mind. Second con of freelancing is that it might not work out for you. Just because you hear people talking about how they've got into freelancing, that they're doing really well with freelancing, you don't hear about the people that tried freelancing and didn't work out for them. Again, I'm not here to demotivate you. I'm just being transparent, being practical, and hopefully that's helpful from your perspective. Another con of freelancing is that there's going to be a massive shift in your paradigm and your ways of thinking. Whereas when you're full-time, you're very linear in your approach to many things. With freelancing, you're going to have to be a bit more open-minded. You're going to have to think and act a bit more holistically, and you're going to have a wider perspective in doing things. Sometimes that might not be your way of doing and thinking, so it's something you have to take into account when you're getting into freelancing. Another con of freelancing is that you're not going to receive any form of benefits, right? So there's no pension payments, there's no paid holidays. If you don't work, you basically don't get paid. You don't get vouchers or discounts. There's no benefits to freelancing, or the companies that you work for very likely won't give you benefits. Another con of freelancing, which isn't talked about much, is the fact that there's going to be a lot more admin work than full-time. So some of those could be accounting, filing your taxes, bookkeeping, managing your website, finding clients. You're going to be doing a lot more proposals. You're going to be interviewing a lot more clients. You're going to face a lot more rejections, and you're going to have to manage your emails as well. There's a lot more administration that happens. Another con of freelancing, which is something I have experienced in the past, you might end up with a really bad client. During the initial interview, it might seem like it will be a good gig in terms of how they're proposing it and in terms of their management style. But once you actually start the gig, you realize that maybe they're a micromanager, maybe they're asking too many questions, maybe they're telling you what to do too often. And in those cases, the great thing about freelancing is, from my experience, when I get those clients, I just fire them. I would recommend when you're interviewing with a client, if you can, try to get to know what makes them tick, how they work, what their leadership style is, what their management style is. There's nothing worse than having a bad client. But again, as mentioned, you can fire those clients if you want to. The final con of freelancing is it can be very mentally straining. In this field, you really need to have resilience, be able to have that sense of perseverance and optimism. You're going going to get a lot of rejections. You're going to have projects and gigs that don't quite pan out. You're going to have invoices not paid. You're just going to have to hustle a lot more. These are practical things that you need to keep in mind when you're getting into freelancing. To that point, I want you to think about what your ideal lifestyle is, connect that to freelancing. And if it doesn't quite connect, then I wouldn't recommend doing freelancing. So really think about the pros and cons of both freelancing and full-time employment. From my perspective, getting into freelancing has really been beneficial in so many ways, not just in terms of monetary income, but the network that I've built, the skill sets that I've built at the same time, and just the whole experience. I look back over the past 2 years, it kind of feels like I'm watching a movie with, there's so many things happening within the span of that time that only freelancing can really do. For me, the pros of freelancing definitely outweigh the cons, but again, as mentioned earlier, think about your ideal lifestyle as a person and see if freelancing supports that ideal lifestyle. So if you're wondering what I'm doing right now, obviously I'm still freelancing, but at the same time, I'm actually building my own agency, which is a part of this channel, Proverb. And even though I'm freelancing on the side, I actually still have full-time employment. This area is flexible, right? Just because you're working full-time doesn't mean you can't freelance on the side. And vice versa, just because you're freelancing doesn't mean you can do full-time or part-time employment on the side. It's really up to you. This is your life, so create the ideal lifestyle that works for you. Use the tools out there. The final tip is, if freelancing doesn't work out, you can always go back into full-time employment. There's no rule saying that once you go into freelancing, you're banned from having full-time employment. And that's the beauty of freelancing. There's the flexibility of going back to full-time employment and vice versa. If you're full-time, there's no rule saying that you can't be a freelancer, right? Life isn't static. Life is very flexible. As long as you have that mindset of trying things out, life tends to be more exciting, and what better way to explore life than to explore freelancing? So go out there, take a risk. It might just be the best decision you make. Peace and love as always. Till next time. Out.